April 29th, 1945, Bavaria, Germany. American soldiers of the U.S. 7th Army entered Dachau concentration camp, an installation that had operated continuously since March 1933. What they encounter is not a battlefield, not surrendering troops, but evidence of industrialized death. Just outside the camp gates, on a railway siding, stands a train, 40 freight cars. Inside them, 2,310 decomposing corpses, men who starved, suffocated, or died of disease during evacuation from other camps as the Third Reich collapsed. Within 30 minutes, between 35 and 100 Waffen-SS guards would be dead, shot by American soldiers without trial. For decades, the U.S. Army tried to bury what happened next. Official reports were altered, witness statements were suppressed, investigations quietly closed. But the documents survived, and they tell a story that forces one impossible question. Was this a war crime or the breaking point of human restraint?
Dachau was not liberated at the end of the Holocaust. It was the beginning. Established on March 22, 1933, Dachau became the model concentration camp for Nazi Germany. Its command structure, guard training system, and punishment methods were copied across the Reich. By 1945, more than 200,000 prisoners from over 30 nations had passed through its gates. At least 41,500 were dead, killed by starvation, disease, medical experimentation, beatings, or execution. As American forces advanced through southern Germany in April 1945, SS administrators attempted to evacuate prisoners to prevent their liberation and to erase evidence. The result was chaos and death. The train discovered by the Americans had departed from Buchenwald, carrying prisoners already weakened by weeks of starvation. During the journey, guards provided no food, no water, and no medical aid. Those who died were not removed. The living were forced to remain among the dead. By the time the train reached Dachau, thousands were already corpses. Others had died only hours earlier. U.S. soldiers from the 45th Infantry Division and 42nd Rainbow Division had seen combat across Europe. They had seen death, but they had never seen this. One American medic later testified, "It was beyond rage. It was something colder."
SS guards from the camp, many of them Waffen-SS, were captured shortly after liberation. Some surrendered without resistance. Others attempted to flee. Then discipline broke. Eyewitness testimony and later investigations described summary executions near a coal yard and along the camp perimeter. Prisoners may have participated in isolated acts of revenge, but the majority of killings were carried out by American soldiers. The number remains disputed. Official reports initially claimed 30 dead. Later evidence suggests at least 35. Some witnesses placed the number closer to 100. The U.S. Army launched an investigation within days. By August 1945, it was quietly closed. No American soldier was court-martialed. For 40 years, the incident was minimized or omitted entirely.
In the first minutes after Dachau's liberation, there was no clear command structure. Combat units were still arriving. Officers were scattered. Prisoners flooded the grounds, many collapsing where they stood. Lieutenant Colonel Felix L. Sparks, commander of the 3rd Battalion, 157th Infantry Regiment, arrived to find American soldiers overwhelmed by what they had seen. The death train was still in view. The smell of decomposition hung over the camp. Captured SS guards, some armed moments earlier, were gathered near the coal yard. Sparks later testified that shots rang out unexpectedly. He ran toward the sound and, according to his own sworn statement, physically intervened, stopping further killings by threatening his own men. This was not a coordinated execution order. It was a breakdown, emotional, psychological, and moral, triggered by evidence of mass murder witnessed at point-blank range. The Geneva Convention still existed, but in that moment, many soldiers believed it no longer applied.
Within days, the U.S. Army launched a formal investigation. The lead investigator, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker, Assistant Inspector General of the 7th Army. Whitaker interviewed dozens of witnesses, soldiers, officers, medics, and former prisoners. His report confirmed that unarmed SS personnel were killed after surrendering. But the language was cautious. Numbers were vague, responsibility blurred. Crucially, Whitaker noted the extraordinary psychological conditions under which the killings occurred, conditions unlike any conventional battlefield engagement. By August 1945, General George S. Patton, now military governor of Bavaria, reviewed the findings. The investigation was closed. No charges were filed. The conclusion was not innocence, it was expedience.
For nearly 40 years, the Dachau executions were absent from official histories, textbooks, and commemorations. Veterans spoke privately, but rarely on record. Military archives restricted access. Public memory focused, understandably, on the crimes of the SS, not the actions of the liberators. When fragments of the stories surfaced in the 1980s, reactions were polarized. Some called it justice delivered by men pushed beyond human limits. Others warned that excusing such acts endangered the very laws meant to prevent future atrocities. The U.S. Army never formally apologized, nor did it formally condemn the soldiers involved. Instead, history remained suspended, unresolved.
Before we continue, a brief pause. If you value carefully researched history, stories told without sensationalism or distortion, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to keep producing long-form documentaries like this one, using original research, archival sources, and balanced historical analysis. We'll return to the story immediately.
The question that Dachau leaves behind has no comfortable answer. International law is clear. Prisoners of war must not be executed without trial. Human reality is not. Many viewers, then and now, argue that the SS guards forfeited all protection the moment the death train existed. Others insist that abandoning the rule of law, even once, risks repeating history rather than ending it. One former American soldier summarized it years later. "We won the war, but that day tested what victory meant." Dachau was liberated, but the moral wound it exposed never healed.
For the prisoners of Dachau, liberation did not arrive as celebration. Many were too weak to stand. Others stared silently, unable to comprehend that the guards who had controlled every breath of their existence were suddenly powerless or dead. Some former inmates later testified that they witnessed SS guards being shot. A few admitted participating in beatings or acts of revenge. Most, however, described something else entirely: emotional numbness. After years of systematic dehumanization, moral clarity did not return instantly. Liberation came tangled with shock, grief, and disbelief.
For many survivors, the executions of SS guards were not remembered as triumph, but as a final grim punctuation to years of cruelty. The men who carried out the executions were not professional executioners. They were infantrymen, many barely out of their teens, who had marched across Europe under orders to defeat an enemy, not to administer justice. Psychologists would later describe Dachau as a triggering event, a moment where accumulated battlefield stress collided with undeniable proof of mass murder. Some soldiers never spoke of Dachau again. Others carried it as a private burden. Years later, several veterans admitted they were unsure whether they had crossed a line or whether the line still existed. The war ended days later, but for some, Dachau never did.
In 1945, the United States faced a global responsibility to prosecute Nazi crimes and establish a legal precedent for crimes against humanity. The Dachau incident complicated that mission. Publicly acknowledging summary executions by U.S. troops risked undermining the moral authority of the upcoming Nuremberg trials. It risked false equivalence between perpetrators and liberators. So the incident was contained, language softened, files restricted. This was not a cover-up in the cinematic sense, but an institutional decision to protect a larger moral narrative in a fragile post-war world.
History often demands clarity. Dachau refuses it. The SS guards were part of a system that engineered mass death. That fact is uncontested. The executions violated international law. That, too, is uncontested. Between those truths lies a space where judgment becomes deeply personal. Some call what happened justice born of horror. Others call it a warning about abandoning restraint. What Dachau proves, perhaps more than anything, is that even in victory, humanity can fracture. And that is why this story, long avoided, still matters.
In the late 1970s and early 1980s, U.S. military archives began to loosen their grip. Inspector General reports, witness statements, and internal correspondence, long classified, were quietly released. Historians reviewing the Dachau files noticed something striking. There was no single order, no execution protocol, no written command authorizing the killings. What emerged instead was fragmentation, contradictory testimonies, cautious phrasing, and deliberate ambiguity. The Army acknowledged deaths, but avoided assigning blame. The truth had not been erased, it had been filed in pieces where only persistence could find it.
As scholars revisited Dachau, interpretations diverged. Some argued that the executions were an inevitable human response to evidence of genocide, an emotional rupture produced by prolonged exposure to combat and atrocity. Others warned that accepting such reasoning risked eroding the foundations of international law. If outrage justified execution, then restraint itself became optional. Notably, no serious historian equated the Dachau killings with Nazi crimes. The scale, intent, and system behind the Holocaust remained incomparable. Yet the question persisted: can moral judgment survive moments when law collapses?
Colonel Felix L. Sparks, the officer who intervened to stop the shootings, lived with Dachau for the rest of his life. In later interviews, he described the executions not with pride, but with exhaustion. He acknowledged that killings occurred, that they were wrong under military law, and that they happened anyway. Sparks rejected both extremes. He did not excuse the actions, nor did he condemn the men as criminals. Instead, he described Dachau as a failure of systems under unbearable pressure, a moment when command, law, and humanity briefly fractured.
Decades later, the Dachau executions still provoke intense reactions. Some viewers see only justice, long overdue and imperfectly delivered. Others see danger in abandoning restraint, even when facing undeniable evil. The divide itself is the legacy. Dachau does not ask us to choose sides. It forces us to confront how thin the line can be between justice and vengeance, even for those who fight on the right side of history. That unresolved tension is why this story, once buried, continues to resurface.
After the war, the world attempted something unprecedented, to place limits on future brutality through law. The Geneva Conventions, revised and expanded in 1949, were shaped directly by the horrors uncovered in camps like Dachau. Prisoners of war were to be protected regardless of crimes committed by their governments. The Dachau executions hovered unspoken in the background of these debates. They were not cited, but they were understood. They served as a warning. If even liberators could cross legal boundaries under extreme conditions, then restraint had to be codified, reinforced, and taught. Law, the post-war world concluded, must exist precisely for moments when emotions collapse.
Despite its gravity, Dachau did not become a legal precedent. No tribunal ruled on it. No doctrine emerged from it. No official judgment defined it as lawful or criminal. Instead, it existed in a gray zone of military history, referenced cautiously by scholars and quietly acknowledged by the U.S. Army. This absence was intentional. The post-war world needed clarity to rebuild. Dachau offered only contradiction. To institutionalize it would have meant confronting uncomfortable truths about victory itself. So it remained an exception, remembered but never codified.
In modern military ethics training, Dachau is sometimes mentioned, but rarely in detail. It is not held up as an example to follow, nor is it framed solely as a crime. Instead, it is presented as a stress fracture, a moment revealing how extreme exposure to atrocity can compromise discipline, judgment, and law. The lesson is not about blame, it is about prevention. Modern armies studied Dachau not to excuse it, but to ensure command structures, psychological support, and accountability prevent such moments from repeating.
At Dachau today, memorial plaques name the victims in Nazi terror. They do not mention the executed SS guards. This omission is deliberate. Memorials exist to honor the dead, not to litigate the moral failures of the living. The focus remains where history agrees without ambiguity, on the victims of systematic murder. Yet beneath the silence, the full story remains known to historians, veterans' families, and those who seek it. Memory does not require verdicts to endure.
The Dachau executions do not redefine the Second World War. They do something more unsettling. They reveal that moral certainty can fracture even on the right side of history. That laws matter most when they are hardest to obey, and that victory does not grant immunity from human failure. Dachau remains a liberation story, but it is also a cautionary one. Not about equivalence, not about justification, but about the cost of witnessing absolute evil and what it can do to those who confront it.
One point must remain absolute. The Dachau executions were not equivalent to the crimes of the SS. They were not planned. They were not systematic. They were not ideological. The Holocaust was an industrial project of annihilation, engineered over years, enforced by law, and defended by doctrine. Dachau shootings were an eruption, brief, chaotic, and contained. To acknowledge one truth does not weaken the other. To confront Dachau honestly is not to diminish Nazi crimes, but to protect history from simplification.
Many American veterans who witnessed Dachau rarely spoke of it, not out of shame alone, but uncertainty. They knew what they had liberated. They knew what they had seen, and they knew what they had done or allowed. Some feared judgment. Others feared misunderstanding. Many believed silence was the only respectful response to events that defied moral language. Their silence was not denial. It was burden.
History does not exist to comfort. It exists to clarify. Modern historians approach Dachau not as prosecutors or defenders, but as examiners of human limits. The consensus is cautious but clear. What happened was unlawful. Why it happened is understandable. What it teaches is essential. Dachau is studied today not to justify vengeance, but to understand how easily justice can fracture under moral overload.
Dachau today is quiet. The barracks are preserved. The railway tracks end in silence. The death train is gone, but its memory is not. What remains is responsibility. Responsibility to remember the victims without distortion. Responsibility to confront uncomfortable truths without denial. Responsibility to teach future generations that moral certainty must be guarded, even in victory.
The Dachau massacre leaves no verdict behind, only a question passed from one generation to the next. If justice collapses in the face of absolute evil, what must be built to hold it? That question is not aimed at the past, it is aimed at us, because history is not finished with Dachau, and neither are we.
If this documentary added clarity, challenged assumptions, or helped preserve an important chapter of history, you can support this work by subscribing to the channel. Liking the video and sharing it helps ensure these stories reach more people and helps history remain visible, accurate, and remembered. Thank you for watching, for reflecting, and for helping this channel grow.